Good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Don Wolfensberger, Director of the Congress Project here, and your moderator today. For those of you who are new to the center, let me just briefly explain what we're about. We were created by an act of Congress in 1968 as a living memorial to the 28th President Woodrow Wilson, who remains the only president to have earned a Ph.D. As you may know, he taught history and government before becoming president of Princeton University, then went on to be governor of New Jersey and then president of the United States. But Wilson firmly believed that both the scholars and the politicians, the thinkers and the doers, would benefit by coming together and exchanging views on issues of the day. And so it's with that in mind that Congress created a living memorial rather than one more monument in Washington. And so we have about 800 meetings in these rooms every year. And a couple of them are going on simultaneously on this very floor, as you will probably hear. The Baker Center is co-sponsoring an event with the Wilson Center across the hall. The Congress Project was created in 1999 in that same spirit, and ordinarily what we do is bring together a member of Congress from each party, a scholar who looks at Congress and how it operates in particular policy issues, and a journalist that covers the Hill, and we discuss how the policy process works and how the politics on the Hill are operating on a particular policy issue. Today is a little different format. We're having a book launch for a book that was just published by Oxford University Press, Parliament and Congress, Representation and Scrutiny in the 21st Century, by Charles W. Johnson, former Parliamentarian of the House, who's now a consultant with the Parliamentarian's office in keeping the precedents updated and published, and Sir William McKay, I'll be all right, who is a former clerk of the British House of Commons. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. I was honored to speak or lecture before a class at American University last week and talk a little bit about the Congress and how I see it operating today. But then during the question period, one of the students asked me, do you think that we would be better off having a parliamentary system here in the U.S.? And I said, well, nobody has specifically asked me that before. I've thought about it. I guess I've written a little bit about it, but I've never been asked point blank. So I naturally evaded the question, but I did indicate that a lot of folks over the years here in the U.S. have advocated a more parliamentary system of government for us because they find our divided powers very frustrating at times and our checks and balances. And certainly Woodrow Wilson was one of those people as a scholar in thinking we'd be better off with something like a cabinet government or whatever. But my answer also, though, went to another aspect, and that is I think the American people have come to both understand and appreciate our constitutional system. If you look at opinion polls, quite often you will see a majority of the people indicating that they think we're better off of a president of one party and a Congress of another. Now, I don't know if that's the independents in the middle who are making that swing decision on that question, because it's not a lopsided answer by any means, but people like the idea of there being a check by the president on Congress and Congress on the president. And so I think political scientists continue to argue to this date as to whether we're better off under divided party government or unified party government. One political scientist, I think it's David Mayhew, has written that both are about equally productive in terms of turning out significant legislation. But we'll leave that debate to another day. After I had given my answer to that student, I ran across a quote that I wish I had had at the time from Thomas Carlyle, who, like our distinguished guest here from the UK, is both a Scot and a product of the University of Edinburgh. And Carlyle was a very famous essayist, a historian, a writer, and he said the following in, I think, an essay that he wrote in 1850 titled The Latter-day Pamphlets. Parliament will train you to talk, and above all things to hear with patience unlimited quantities of foolish talk. And he went on that a parliament, especially a parliament with newspaper reporters firmly established in it, is an entity which by its very nature cannot do work, but can do talk only. And after reflecting on that, I thought, well, maybe we're more a parliamentary system than I was willing to admit previously, because I think a lot of folks right now think that there is a lot of talk, a great deal of partisanship, and little getting done. But I think we see this come and go. We see the pendulum swing. But it certainly does pose some interesting questions as we approach the subject of Parliament and Congress and comparing the two. What I have asked our speakers to do is spend about 15 minutes each, and I let Charlie and Sir William decide which order they would like to go in, and then Walter Oleszek, who will be our commentator. Walter is a senior specialist at the Congressional Research Service and has been there, it seems, almost forever, but I certainly remember him going way back to the 1970 Reorganization Act. He's been involved in a lot of congressional reform efforts in both the House and the Senate over the years and does a lot of good analysis for the Congressional Research Service, but Walter will provide some commentary, and then we'll have a little go-around among the panel before we open it up to questions from you in the audience. But I would like to ask two things. First of all, since this is a live webcast, if you do have any electronic devices, please turn them off because they will interfere with our transmission. And then secondly, when we do get to the question period, if you would wait for the microphone and just identify yourself and your affiliation, we'd appreciate that. And then the last announcement I'll make is that following the reception at the program at 5:30, we'll have a brief reception in this room, and there will be some books available for purchase at a very nice discount, I might add. So with that, let me turn things over to Charlie Johnson or his counterpart, whichever order you'd like to go in. And we've been asked to use the podium for a better line of sight for our webcast, so thank you.
Thank you, Don. It's really a pleasure to be here and see some very familiar faces. And Bill, McKay, and I have become close friends. And I want to give you just a little bit of the background on how this project got started. There was a book written, Parliament and Congress, in 1971 and updated in '82 by then Clerk of the House of Commons, or a Clerk, Sir Kenneth Bradshaw, and his associate David Pring, and it was good as far as it went, and it's now totally out of date. But as I drove Bill to the airport 7 years ago, after he'd been here for an exchange, and we've had a number of exchanges, both at the staff level and member level, both coming both ways, and they've been extremely beneficial, I know, to people on our side who understand better, in relative terms, comparative forms of government. And when we do receive parliamentarians from over the world, we are better. I always insisted that we be able to ask as many questions as we answer. So that gives a better understanding, at least it has to me, of the House of Representatives over these years. But Bill and I started in roughly the same time. I started on May 20th, 1964, right out of law school in the Army. Bill had been in the clerk's office in Parliament for a year or so prior to that. We each worked 40 years, and he retired about a year before I did. I retired 40 years to the day. But in my trip to the airport with him, he said, how'd you like to collaborate on a book that updates Parliament and Congress? And, I was a little tired. I said, all right. And here we are 7 years later. It's been a long, a part-time project, but certainly a rewarding one, because we both felt as insiders that we were able, for the first time in our respective careers as nonpartisan insiders, to be somewhat judgmental and analytical about changes that we've seen. And certainly the major emphasis of my segment of the book is change, the abruptness of it and the severity of it and the unfairness of it in many cases. At least that's my feeling. And so I've been able to express that without any partisan inclinations, I hope. Some people will say, why did you say that about the Speaker, the Majority Leader? And the comment is really on the office and how the rules and precedents and procedures of the House interact with those offices. It's certainly not a commentary on personalities that have held any office. And so we started out and we submitted an outline, a very ambitious outline to Oxford University Press, and they had 4 referees review it. One of them reported back, this thing won't fly because these people, in order to have survived for 40 years, must have had their heads stuck in the sand. And of course that was a little bit of an aggravation to us, and it was precisely, I think we believe it was precisely because we didn't have our heads in the sand that we were able to survive, at least to be able to look around. And so we started out, and the book is 12 chapters, and it covers every aspect procedurally and institutionally of the House and somewhat of the Senate. I had to appear to know what I was talking about with respect to the Senate, and that wasn't easy, because one of the more sustaining, continuous moments as I worked on the House side was to remind myself how much worse it could be working on the Senate side, and that was a sustaining thought. And I started in '64, and the House was a very different place. It was spontaneous, it was open, it had a large Democratic majority. It had Speaker Foley's predecessor, 3 times removed. Speaker Foley has honored us by his presence. It's great to see you, Mr. Speaker. And John McCormick was Speaker then, and followed by Carl Albert, Tip O'Neill, Jim Wright, and Speaker Foley, and then followed by Speakers Gingrich and Hastert. And I retired during Mr. Hastert's speakership, and now Madam Speaker Pelosi is the Speaker. And my relationship with all those speakers was different, one from the other, but it was personal and it was rewarding for me. And I developed early on almost an emotional attachment, and I say this in the introduction or in the conclusion somewhere in the book, about how perhaps I was more emotionally attached before I was intellectually and critically attached. And I'm glad I was, because it was a sustaining matter in my career. It enabled me to compare the House then and now, the Congress then and now, and to maybe hope from time to time that things would revert, a pendulum would swing back. Normally that has not happened. Things have changed. But then when I had to be critical in various areas, I focused on 4 or 5 different areas. And I focused on the politics of partisan reapportionments, for example, where members who are elected to primaries tend to come from more extreme ideological backgrounds. Moderates in primaries don't participate. And then if those more or less conservative and liberal members are elected, they tend not to want to reach out across the aisle, if only because they have people reach out toward them, because they may have been very negative in a campaign, and it may have influenced how they feel about new members coming in. And so that collegiality, that matter of welcome, has been an issue, and based in part on the people who come to the Congress through these partisan primaries, where the districts, as most of you know, are quite partisanly drawn now with computers. But then one of my main focuses, and certainly not as an expert, is on campaign financing, but how it's impacted on members' lives and on the House and Senate as an institution. And I think Bill and I agreed. We talked to Brian Lamb today on C-SPAN, and that'll run in a couple weeks, I suppose. But he asked us what one of the biggest differences was between the two bodies, and I went right to campaign financing, both the amounts, the lengths of time, it's a nonstop operation here, and the detraction that it is for members from their ability to be collegial across the aisle, particularly. And Bill will comment perhaps later on how he doesn't see that so much as a problem, but certainly I and many of you I know here in the room see that as a big problem. Without as long as you've got Buckley against Vallejo and you've got other reasons to raise money perpetually to build up campaign war chests, the issue of collegiality the phenomenon of collegiality has certainly diminished from when I came. But Brian asked me today, what about television? What impact has television had in the way Congress operates and members deal with each other? And I said, well, it's been, and he quoted right out of the book, and he wanted to put me on the spot to say television has not been a good thing, because he knew I would say that in part, but I linked it to the advent of special orders of business emanating from the Rules Committee in the late 80s under Speaker Wright, beginning under Speaker Wright, but certainly escalating under Speaker Gingrich and Hastert, whereby the Rules Committee, unique among committees in the world, and the House, the most unique rule of the House is that which empowers the Rules Committee to adopt virtually overnight, to recommend rules that change the standing rules of the House, that waive them on an ad hoc basis. But the profound effect of that is to, more often than not, in fact, almost always now, depart from those guarantees in the standing rules that offer individual members and minorities chances to participate, especially at the plenary level. And that has accelerated. And Madam Speaker Pelosi, when she first became Speaker, had waged a campaign toward openness, toward fewer so-called modified or structured rules. And then when she became Speaker, the number increased. And again, this new, I read in the paper, this Republican pledge toward reform pledges a renewal of openness during the amendment process. But to me, that is a very important part of the House. Now, of course, in the Senate, it's a converse relationship, because the Senate has no germaneness rule except during reconciliation debates and post-cloture debates. The Senate allows virtually any senator to offer an amendment, unless they do artificial things like filling the amendment tree. And so I had to try to understand that, but my heart and soul and most of what's left of my mind were on the House, and what the impact of the total utilization of the Rules Committee, 9-4. That ratio speaks volumes, because it's the ratio of majority to minority members on that committee. The 9 are appointed by the Speaker. And this is not partisan to the Democrats now. It's been a tradition that the majority has a 2-to-1, a 2-to-1 plus 1 ratio. And those people are chosen directly by the Speaker without having to go through the caucus and any kind of secret ballot or the steering committee. So they are understood to be supportive of the Speaker's agenda, and they produce the Speaker's agenda. Of course, the House has a chance to reject that agenda or to amend it to open up a procedure, but those votes never materialize because those are, quote, procedural votes, which the majority has convinced its members demand party loyalty. So that, together with television and ratcheting down so that the time is limited and divided by 2 managers rather than each and every member wanting to get his or her own time by striking the last word, that has greatly diminished spontaneity in the House. And television, at least early on, members didn't want to yield to others or to have others get time to second guess them by getting their own time. So they would write speeches, and still do, that consume the whole time. And to me, that has very much diminished the spontaneity of the House. And I would virtually say that debates don't influence votes anymore. There may be exceptions if something spontaneous comes up, a question of privilege. But for the most part, votes only happen when the majority party allows them to happen through a special rule. The exception, of course, being motions to recommit, which is the minority's last chance to offer a germane alternative. And sometimes those are very demagogic and troublesome. And, of course, the majority wants to limit the number of embarrassing votes its own vulnerable members have to cast, and also limit the number of votes that minority members can offer. But my other real focus, and it includes the utilization of the Rules Committee, has been what I call at the end of the book the inverse ratio axiom between the importance urgency, complexity, and cost of major legislation on the one hand, and the amount of time and the transparency and fairness that is accorded to all members in understanding that material on the other. The more important and complex, the less time members have, and that's proven over and over again. There are relatively few conference reports anymore. There are amendments between the houses used deliberately, as I understand it will be tomorrow, and the continuing where the Senate will add a continuing. The House will not have originated it. The Senate will have used a House Foreign Operations bills as a vehicle that's over in the Senate, and then the House can, by late tomorrow, perhaps vote up or down on a continuing budget for the entire government virtually through late November. That cuts off the minority's motion to recommit and is yet a further departure. So when I combine all those fundraising, reapportionment, Rules Committee, and television, and the notion that winning at all costs is the essence of what they have to do, I end up, throughout the book, I'm pessimistic but not yet totally cynical. And we have a blog, Oxford, and then I'll sit down now. The book was submitted a year ago, so Bill couldn't comment on then in the book about major developments, coalition government, et cetera, and I didn't have a chance to comment on the healthcare process. And so we did a blog, and that's online with Oxford, and invite you to read that. We're not inviting anyone to comment on it. It's just to try to indicate that the book sets the basis for an understanding of things that have since happened and are yet to happen. Thank you.
Sir William McKay.
There are a number of paradoxes in what I'm going to say. The first one is that, like Charlie, I served before the mast for 40 years, and I like things to stay as they were. I used to understand procedure, and when they go and change it, I don't like it. And yet, my bit of this book is, to my surprise more than anyone else, optimistic. That said, the central paradox will be familiar to you, of parliamentary government. And I state it only to remind you that recent events are making a paradox more paradoxical. Here we have a system in which government members, at any rate, are returned to the House with the duty, constitutionally, of supporting the government, and the duty, institutionally, of criticising them. This is because the House of Commons in particular was once an institutional opposition. But it's not anymore. Now, that circle was squared for many, many years by iron-fisted whipping, by the government making sure that the party in Parliament which supported it had very little independent authority. Whipping, as I say, was iron-fisted. We have seen men dying in ambulances in the New Palace Yard, and the doctors going to make sure they were still alive so that they could be, as it were, as we say, nodded through the division lobbies. Whips of both parties had to inspect these poor folk and be certain they were still alive so that their votes could be cast without their going through the lobbies. I mean, this was grotesque. This terrible state of affairs is now easing. It started in 1979, and I'll come back to that. It started in 1979, and I think it has gathered pace throughout the 1990s. And the House of Commons now is far more comfortable exercising its institutional critical role than it has been for many, many decades. What has been done, therefore, in that direction? Well, we've invented a part-time new House of Commons. We did it by a piece of existential nonsense. We call it the House sitting in Westminster Hall. First of all, it's not the House, but it's not a committee either. And it doesn't sit in Westminster Hall. But that, and on one day of the week, the House sits in Westminster Hall and in the chamber. And I defy you to make any sense out of that. But the real point is, we have invented many hours more a week of parliamentary time. It's true that in Westminster Hall you can't vote, so that the business tends to be worthy rather than politically critical. But it's the business which would not otherwise have been debated. The other modification of the government's iron hand was on the floor in legislative time. The great problem facing every government since about 1830 has been the balance between business and time. Governments have got as much business as they can possibly think of. God has made time finite, and reconciling the two has never been very easy. And we have developed all sorts of ways for bringing debate to an untimely end. The crudest one was a guillotine, which simply parceled a bill out into gobbets and said, when it comes to 5:30, bang, down comes the knife, all outstanding questions are put. And if you haven't debated the business, well, tough, we just move on to something else. We now have what are called programme orders, which I regard as the gentlemanly version of guillotines. The opposition are listened to. Things are done so far as they can be done to timetable these bills by consent. Now, of course, there's still a lot of griping. Amendments are tabled in good faith. They're important. They may not be debated. But all efforts are bent to avoiding that situation, prioritising business so as to fit it within time, and that it will go on. Of course, there are some things that haven't yet been tackled. If this reconstruction of the House's institutional critical function is to work, private members need, other than the government, private members need to promote more bills. That's not really been tackled yet. Also, we need to improve legislative procedure. We have been doing that. Well, House of Lords Committee has concluded, and governments have grudgingly agreed in principle, that most important bills should come before the House in draft, so that they can be kicked around, stamped on, reshaped, then sent back to the government with, give us something like this. And now that's much easier to do when the bill is in draft. When you get a proper bill, then the battalions are drawn up on either side and it's difficult to make amendments. So the first thing is draft bills. That's been progressed. Post-legislative scrutiny is coming along. It's more of an idea than a reality at the moment. But God knows, how are you going to make a decent act of Parliament unless you know how the last one is working? The ordinary legislative procedure, now it may sound strange to American ears, but when we sent a bill to a committee in the past, it went upstairs to a committee which simply undertook political scrutiny. Nobody asked the people likely to be affected what they thought about it. Well, we've changed that now, and what used to be an exclusively political exercise is now founded in, well, some aspect of fact. And I think that has improved quite a lot. But the most important change has been select committees. Select committees, investigative bodies, they may take bills, they may take draft bills, but they're really, at their core, the 19 select committees of about 12 to 14 members who cover government departments. And they have a remit to look at the expenditure and the policy of departments. They are not, and they never will be for constitutional reasons, authoritative centres of power. But by gum, they're informed, and if you listen, and I regard this as a good test, if you listen to the radio, the political programmes of a morning, when something blows up, you now hear the BBC turning to the chairman of the relevant select committee. Sometimes, if a committee is taking evidence from a minister, the committee knows an awful lot more than the minister does. I can think of a European Scrutiny Committee, which looks at European legislation. The House has its own links into Brussels. These sometimes act an awful lot faster than the civil service links. So you get a poor minister giving evidence to a committee, and the committee are quite incredulous. What, you didn't know this was happening, Minister? I mean, there can be nothing more humiliating for a minister to be behind the game to that extent. Let me give a particular example. For most of my career, the Prime Minister never appeared to give evidence before a select committee. There was no rule about it, but he just damn well wasn't coming. But now, Prime Ministers appear before a committee of the chairman of other select committees, and they don't know what they're going to be asked because it can come out of the blue. A topic can just appear, and the Prime Minister's got to know about it. You would think that these bodies, these select committees, would fall into the hands of the whips, and so they did. But they are now emerging from that bind. And the other good thing is, even in the worst days of government domination, select committees were bipartisan. I could go into why that's so, the book does. But they were bipartisan. It is realised there is no good if a select committee comes out with the views it went in to the committee room with before the inquiry started. And they're not doing that. They are genuinely arriving at conclusions which very often disoblige the government, and these conclusions are signed up to by members of both houses. So, in all these ways, the House is acting as an institution. It's outward looking. Its committees, for example, hold joint meetings with, let's say, the Foreign Affairs Committee will talk to the Foreign Affairs Committee in Paris or in Berlin, in Madrid. They will even talk to the relevant committees in Edinburgh and Cardiff. So, for the first time, the walls of Palace of Westminster are becoming rather more transparent. Of course, everything isn't perfect. It's still very, very difficult for a committee to impose its will on a reluctant minister. We want the minister to come along and talk to us. The minister says no. Or a very reluctant witness from the outside, a journalist. I'm not going to come and tell you because press freedom stops me. Committees are working still with outdated powers. I suspect these will have to be G'd up before long. They've got expanded authority. All treaties on constitutional lines here, but without the same authority, treaties go to select committees. There are not so much confirmation hearings, but pre-appointment hearings of senior government officials, particularly those with a regulatory power. As you probably know, much of the power of the British government was covered by the magic word prerogative, i.e. the old powers of the Crown, which devolved on the government after the Revolution. And the government would never give Parliament a look in. Well, they have now. And it has been agreed that if and when we go to war, Afghanistan or Iraq, Parliament will be consulted and there will be a proper vote. Parliament was always consulted, a little behind the game, on a motion for the adjournment. That's going to be sharpened up. That's a big change. The prerogative was the weapon of last resort for the government, and they're surrendering it. Of course, there are also threats in all this. I mean, we're making progress. The biggest threat, I'm sorry to tell you, is the damn judges. It was observed not very long ago that step by step, this is from the Court of Appeal, the principle of the absolute legislative sovereignty of Parliament, which Dicey derived from Coke and Blackstone, is being qualified. Yeah, damn right it was. Now, there was a case about the bill to prohibit hunting. Whether that the accelerated procedure of that case was or was not valid. In other words, did the House use powers which it didn't have to accelerate the procedure of that bill? Now, on the one hand, it was just a matter of statutory interpretation. On the other, the decision on statutory interpretation went to the validity of the bill. And this brought the pains on very hard, because the courts have not interfered with the validity of legislation since the 17th century. The decision came right. But what worries us still is the remarks, the obituary remarks by some of the judges saying, well, it was the courts who invented parliamentary sovereignty and the courts can put an end to it, to which the answer is nuts. It was the revolution that invented parliamentary sovereignty. So, there are a lot of battles to be fought with these guys. In the old days, parliamentary privilege, particularly the privilege of freedom of speech, when it got to the courts, because parliamentary privilege of freedom of speech is enshrined in statute, it's not an unwritten parliamentary privilege, when the Bill of Rights 1689 was interpreted, the courts looked to the broad, deep verities of the Constitution. Now they interpret the statute very narrowly. It's going to be difficult to preserve Parliament in the light of things like that, in the light of human rights acts. We have had to go to the European Court of Human Rights and defend freedom of speech in Parliament. And it so happened that at least one of the judges in the European Court of Human Rights thought we were wrong and that freedom of speech in Parliament in the UK was too broad. That simply sitting at one's desk, reading the papers of us having to defend parliamentary freedoms in a court outside the jurisdiction was profoundly uncomfortable. The other threat, I think, we can cope with, and that's European law. We have an elaborate system, in the book we describe it, of scrutiny of what's going on in Europe. But there are so many rabbit holes into that warren, you can't cover them all. And we always will have to be vigilant to see that we keep an eye on what's going on in Europe. We keep a committee which is very, very active, because the only way to tackle European law is not after it's made, but while it's in the making. I want nearly to finish with the reform of the Lords. The British political classes love talking about the reform of the House of Lords, and they've been doing so for about a century. And there's no reason why it should ever stop, because I think everybody enjoys it. But the trouble is, something has got to be done. Okay, we got rid of the hereditaries. We left only 92 hereditary peers. But since then, that number of the Lords has gone up again. The Lords, it was said, in its unreformed state, was unique among legislatures because its operation was assured only by the absenteeism of most of its members. And we're getting back to those days. We have not found a bridge between the two principles of a House of Lords with legitimacy, but not very much legitimacy in case it should challenge the House of Commons. I don't know where that pendulum will stop. I don't want to talk about reform of allowances, but I suppose I'd better. As you probably know, a great tsunami of criticism hit the House and about 18 months ago. And the details of claims for various allowances had been released to the press. The press went public with them. Many of them were simply silly. Some of them may, depending on actions now in the courts, may be judged, I don't know, criminal. Very few. It was a good example of what happens if you take your eye off the ball, but more, it was a good example of the power of the press. Because when that tsunami broke, the House of Commons already had assurances by auditors that there wasn't much wrong with the system. There was external audit. Allowances and pay could no longer be determined by the House, but were to be determined externally. But so great was the power of the press that we, the House, had to put its mind to devising a system which policed a sovereign parliament. And that was not easy, and it's not working very well. And it will be jolly interesting to see where this threat rests. So we made a lot of progress, but we're not there yet.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll hear from Walter Oleszek, Senior Specialist at the Congressional Research Service.
Thanks very much, Don, for hosting this event. That's the first thing I want to say, and also to thank Senate Director Lee Hamilton for also allowing this to go forward. And Charlie indicated, or Don did, that I think Lee even recommended that this kind of book launch be had. And on the title of the book, I find it very interesting because, to repeat it, Parliament and Congress, Representation and Scrutiny in the 21st Century. Now, these two gentlemen, Bill and Charlie, they're really smart guys, as we know. They are far-sighted thinkers. And they put the word 21st century, the couple of words there, in this title because I'm sure they're hopeful and expecting that this book will be around for decades to come and will be a bestseller among parliamentarians worldwide. Now, the second point I would like to make, just by introduction, is that certainly nice to see so many folks turn out who are really Charlie's friends and others in this room friends. You can be sure if this event was held in Westminster, there would be scores of friends and colleagues of Bill McKay's as well. But there are Democrats and Republicans here, and the only point that I want to emphasize is that both of these gentlemen, Charlie and Bill, 40 years each serving their respective institutions, provided to both parties, or the many parties they had to serve, objective, impartial analysis and information to both sides of the aisle. And that's often tough to do in a highly often partisan environment. And I also want to mention that the current sitting parliamentarian, John Sullivan, is also present. Now, Don asked me to say a few words about the book, which I'll do, and maybe to comment a little bit on what he had, at least in an email that I read, about whether or not we have any kind of iron law of emulation here, where there are some things that the British Parliament has now taken up that we perhaps were prominent in, and likewise are we also imitating something that they have had over the years. And I will be brief. That was the message given to me by Don, and it's understandable simply because, hey, the Q&A directed mostly to Bill and Charlie. So as King Henry VIII said to each of his many wives, "Don't worry, I won't keep you long." Now, in terms of the book itself, I mean, it is really quite an effort to put so much jam-packed into a book that is 577 pages. And you lift it, it's very heavy because there's so much in it. All of the rules, all of the practices, all of the precedents, all of the processes of each chamber, each institution are reflected in this volume. It is probably about as up-to-date as you can get. I mean, you look at the table of contents, and I will just quickly, mention a couple. He's got 12 chapters in here, and under each chapter heading, there is a list, subheadings of all of the material that's covered in each chapter. So you look at, for example, Chapter 9. It has stuff in here about the introduction and referral of bills, and I mean, really, it's detailed information. Committees in Congress, legislative scheduling, Cloture in the Senate even. Well, it could go on. The point is this is chock full of really very useful information about the parliamentary processes in the United States House and the United States Senate, and of course in the House of Commons and the House of Lords as well. So obviously I commend it to you. And obviously written by two very knowledgeable people who've had extensive training, if you will, and experience, practical experience in understanding the legislative process. Now, one of the things that I learned, and I learned a whole lot, and I've been trying to study this kind of effort for many decades, this one, a couple of things caught my eye, and one of those I want to mention because everybody's probably familiar with it, and that's the question period in the House of Commons, and actually in all parliamentary bodies that take their lineage from the House of Commons. And of course, we've had periodically members of the House, members of the Senate over time recommend that maybe the United States Congress, House, Senate, or both, ought to experiment with a question period. Jimmy Carter, for example, on the campaign trail in 1976, recommended that he would like to participate in a question period. Well, I guess it didn't happen. In 2008, I found this quote by Senator John McCain when he was campaigning for the White House. And he said, as president, he would ask Congress to grant me the privilege of coming before both houses to take questions and address criticism, much the same as the Prime Minister of Great Britain appears regularly before the House of Commons. Well, obviously nothing happened there. But in terms of something that I thought was quite interesting, and I would wager, and I'm not going to put much money on it, that probably many people in this room would be unfamiliar with the possibilities of a question period in the United States Congress. And this is obviously something that was prepared by Charlie. Well, I lost my paperclip. No, I got it. And let me read because it's going to be self-explanatory. And this was an eye-opener for me personally, and maybe to some of you as well. On the annual occasion, when the President delivers his State of the Union message in person, both houses are technically in joint session, and the President is free, if he wishes, to entertain questions from members. Speaker Champ Clerk, who's a Democrat from Missouri, on January 13, 1915, in response to a parliamentary inquiry as to whether a member or senator could interrogate the President, indicated that, now we'll quote Speaker Champ Clerk, and this is what he said. The chair investigated that once, and nothing of the sort has happened in Congress since Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as president the first time, because no president since that time has read a speech before Congress except President Wilson. But before that, it does seem that they interrogated the president. Not very frequently, but it was done. The opinion of the present occupant of the chair is that the President would have the right to refuse to be interrogated. In the opinion of the chair, the Speaker has nothing to do with it, and a member or senator should address the President directly. It might be an order, but it would be exercising wretched taste. Anyway, of course, sometimes we do have tastelessness in the State of the Union addresses, but so it goes. It just occurred to me another point about this was, I'm sure Bill put this one in. They have television in the House of Commons, and there was a term that he used when a member is speaking, and there's hardly anybody in the chamber, that a lot of his colleagues, to give the impression that there's a lot of people in the room, shades of the episode with Newt Gingrich and Speaker O'Neill, but anyway, they all gather around him, and that is called donutting. And then the reverse occurs, that if someone doesn't like the MP who's speaking, then in an ostentatious display, a bunch of members get up to exit the chamber, which I thought, hey, sort of interesting kind of a concept. But anyway, we have walkouts too in the House of Representatives. Now, in terms of, moving on to the second part, Don mentioned, maybe say a few words about it. I was going to say a little bit about committees. Bill McKay has already covered that in terms of one of the things that perhaps the House of Commons has taken from the House of Representatives and perhaps the Senate is a greater reliance on committees, especially select committees, if they want to, investigate the chamber. Now, I also want to, while he talked about investigations, I also wanted to, indicate that there's a good chapter in here on scrutiny and oversight. And there's so much covered here. Every rule, every practice, every public law, every Supreme Court decision that's rendered that bolsters the prerogative of the Congress to exercise congressional oversight is in here. Things even like resolutions of inquiry, depositions, the impact of multiple referral on the oversight function. So a heck of a lot is in here on all of these diverse topics. Committees, Bill McKay has already covered that. Maybe I'll say a couple of words, however, about whether or not, as some scholars and commentators like to say, maybe we have, in recent years, maybe it's been recent decades now, sort of a semi-parliamentary system. And maybe that's a concept that we borrowed from the House of Commons, but we do have a greater degree of party line voting, greater degree of polarization in the House and the Senate. So it's not uncommon these days, as we all know, for the majority party to vote one way and the minority party to vote against, all united, as in health care. And that seems to be common practice on the big ticket items called message agenda items that often dominate consideration of issues in the House and the Senate. Of course, you can go on in this vein about what are the reasons that have contributed to this rise of a sharper partisan period in the United States Congress. There's also, lots of interest groups, as we know, who affiliate closely with the Democratic or Republican Party. There's a partisan communications network all across America that amplify and intensify partisan disagreements between Democrats and Republicans. President Obama campaigned on the theme of being a post-partisan president, and of course he's stretched out his hand, and sometimes it's hard to grasp on the other side. But it's not necessarily his fault. I would argue that the forces of sharper partisanship are far more pronounced than the general public sense that why can't these people get along? And there's a lot of reasons why they can't get along, and Charlie mentioned a bunch of them. I mentioned a couple. And of course, maybe another point ought to be made as well, that members of the House and members of the Senate are not elected to get along. They're elected to try to accomplish their policy objectives and to serve their constituents. Now, we hope they do it with a degree of decorum and civility, but often that's not, the case these days and in many, many instances because of intense partisan and policy differences between the two chambers. Now, there was a mention that Don made early on about whether or not, we ought to have a parliamentary system or a consideration of it here. That's as he said, is for another time. But one of the dilemmas with having a parliamentary body is that you could have the majority party impose a policy where there is no consensus in the country surrounding it. And I'm not sure that's a pretty good idea. That's not a very good idea in a country as large and diverse as we have in the United States. So I don't think we're going to ever get a parliamentary body, quite frankly, but it's a nice academic argument and discussion to have. Basically, to simplify, what we have in a parliamentary system is the fusion of the legislative and executive branch, which obviously heightens accountability to a degree. What we have here, as we all know, is a separation of power system, the dispersion of power. Let's call it diffusion, which often leads to a great deal of confusion. But that's the order of the system. Quite often on Capitol Hill at the Congressional Research Service, we have visiting parliamentarians who come from other countries. And depending on the country that they come from, some of them will ask, well, who's in charge around here? You know, who's running the place? And I usually respond gently, of course, that, well, perhaps that's not the right question at all. Maybe the better question to ask is anybody in charge? Because it's so difficult to figure out, given the array of institutions we have and the forces and factors involved in policymaking, to figure out why things happen or why they don't happen. Well, lots of differences between the House of Commons and the United States Congress. The Speaker, and we're certainly honored to have former Speaker Tom Foley here for sure. Our Speaker, as you know, one of the jobs is to be a party leader. And of course, the Speaker of the House of Commons is fundamentally a nonpartisan officer of that chamber. House and Senate, much different. You know, House of Commons, House of Lords here. Of course, the Senate is a very formidable institution. Every single senator's got awesome parliamentary prerogatives, and that's why, regardless of which party, even if they're the same party controlling both bodies, House members often will say, you know, the minority party, in this case, the Republicans, they're only the opposition. The Senate is the enemy. So, and you can go on in terms of this laundry list of differences between the two institutions, but to conclude, I simply want to reemphasize that this is certainly a magnificent book. I'm glad all of you have turned out to honor this masterful achievement. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Before I open the floor to questions, I thought I would just start out taking the prerogative of the chair and ask both of our co-authors to comment briefly on how they see the differences today between the British Parliament and the U.S. Congress in terms of the purse strings, the powers of the purse. It was the British Parliament that first established that authority in rebellion against the king and made sure that the Parliament controlled the purse strings. But to what extent do you have the scrutiny in the Parliament versus the U.S. Congress? How are the spending bills handled in both bodies? I just thought I'd ask this because we're up against the new fiscal year in a couple of days, and none of the regular money bills have been signed into law yet. But go ahead, gentlemen.
Well,
use a microphone.
I have to say, in the House of Commons, appropriation bills are not debatable. There's no system of appropriation, and the bills which do appropriate the spending to the purposes, as I said, are undebatable, and they really only serve as checklists for the National Audit Office. Now, that's because, although the Revolution won financial authority for the Parliament, damn government got it back in about 20 years. And one of the earliest standing orders, you wouldn't be surprised, is that we're not going to spend any money unless the Crown, i.e. the government, recommends it. So, in the case of expenditure on a bill, on actually putting a bill into effect, the government associate with the bill a resolution describing the purposes for which money is to be spent under the bill, and no member who is not a member of the government may propose either extending the term over which the tax is levied or increasing the rate of levying the tax. And that's particularly true in the finance bill, which encapsulates the budget. These are the traditional and indeed constitutional, and I do not think overthrowable, limits. On the other hand, select committees, which used to go for the nice sexy topics, something you could make an impact with, are now realizing that if you have a look at the expenditure of the government department you're covering, you can discover a whole lot of unpleasant things. And you can make life hot for the minister and the civil service. So that's where the real control of expenditure rests. This is to repeat, this is a constitutional issue. It's not for the Parliament in our system to spend money on its own authority. But it can have as good a go as it wants, and that go is getting better at the government's spending.
Charlie, the Congress.
Brian Lamb posed that question earlier, so we've had a little practice in responding, but we don't have all that much time. But there are several areas of basic contrast in addition to the contrast of the position of Speaker and campaign financing and perhaps ethics for ethical personal attacks. But Chapter 6 of our book on power of the purse really makes the distinction that responds to the question that Don has asked. And in the case of the Congress, as former Appropriations Chair, Mr. Representative Fazio knows all too well, we're honored by his presence too, by the way. At least I am. There are four levels of decision making in the House that are perpetual, and they all have a budgetary spending and revenue impact. The budget process itself, which is ground to a halt this year, but which the Senate was able to utilize under the term of reconciliation based on last year's budget resolution to bring to the Senate floor without a 60-vote necessary threshold to invoke cloture, the health bill. And so, but the time and energy spent on budget resolution issues and resulting reconciliation legislation is all-consuming. It can be, and it's very often frustrating because it doesn't reach conclusion. And under the timetable in the Budget Act, the authorization process, which is kind of gotten the short end of the stick since the Budget Act gradually over the years, the authorization process, which presumably under the rules of the House, not under law, requires an enactment of an authorization bill into law before an appropriation can even be considered in the House, or less often in the Senate. That rule is virtually waived all the time now because authorization bills do not, in a timely way, get enacted, and there are a number of reasons for that. There's no urgency such as there is on appropriation bills, because appropriation bills can come up and get enacted with waivers of points of order without those authorization bills which set the policy levels of spending even having been considered, much less enacted. And then, of course, I wish Mr. Brain had stayed. There's the revenue process, which presumably the House originates, and we all know the politics. We know of the politics of taxes now, and the more internally the intramural debates between the Ways and Means Committee in the House and other committees who are trying to raise revenues by the utilization of fees as opposed to taxes. Been a huge institutional issue, and I spent a lot of time in the book on that. But overall, over the course of a fiscal year, and the fiscal year begins October 1st, and there needs to be some spending authority in place for the government prior to October 1st, and right now there isn't. But as I said in my earlier remarks, there's about to be, and if you watch tomorrow's proceedings, I think, as I'm told, and I certainly don't have any inside information, the House will not originate for the first time ever that we've had a continuing appropriation. The House will not have originated it, but rather the Senate, and if this doesn't happen, you didn't hear it from me. But because of the sensitivity of the minority motion to recommit in the House, the Senate has in front of it a foreign operations appropriation bill. So there's a vehicle that has passed the House that is eligible for amendment in the Senate. And my information is
that's from last year, isn't it?
Yeah. But the Senate, not necessarily caught up by a germaneness rule, will perhaps amend, and they have invoked cloture in the Senate, 83 votes to invoke cloture on the amendment that will add the continuing of appropriation for the government all the way through near the end of November until there's a lame duck session to resolve the remainder, if it's either going to be a further continuing or an omnibus appropriation bill. Both, to my way, traditional way of thinking, I won't call them abominations, but certainly departures from the rules and traditions of the House. But then when that Senate amendment comes back attached to the Foreign Operations House-passed bill, the Rules Committee will report a special rule making it in order for an up or down vote without a motion to recommit that is otherwise guaranteed the minority if the bill were originating in the House. But because it's a Senate amendment, the Rules Committee is not constrained and can and probably will eliminate any motion to recommit, so there'll be no Republican budget alternative for the continuing. Of course, it's just a month. It's the current rates, the lower of whatever rates, and it's not great policy making, although there may be other provisions in it. But I'm just trying to give you several samplings of how tortured and how ongoing and really futile these days all aspects of the budget process in Congress are. No more stark comparison than to, as Bill said, the way the government gets its way on budgeting in the United Kingdom.
Just
Yes.
maybe, Don, on a more happier note, remember, October 1 is coming, and you can all celebrate Happy Fiscal New Year.
Right. Okay. With that, let's go to questions from the audience. Please raise your hands and wait for a microphone. Let's start over here with Philippa Strum.
Thank you. I'm Philippa Strum. I'm a senior scholar at the Wilson Center. Thanks for the presentation. They were really enlightening. I want to pick up on the scrutiny question, and that goes to the question hour in Commons. In the mid-'70s, I spent 3 weeks in London going to Commons to sit in on the question hour and wrote an article saying that we should adopt it in the United States. I don't think I would write that same article today at all. But it seemed to me then that there were a number of uses for the members of the question hour. One was to express angst at what the government was doing. Another was to make the ministers feel uncomfortable. But a third was to get information. And since then, two things have happened from your description. One is television, and the second is the select committees. So I'm wondering, do you think that the select committees have taken over the information gathering function of question hour, or is there still a question time, rather? Is there still a utility to question time?
Yes, because I think the average member may want to gather information on a subject which is not covered by any committee he sits on. So you can't go to the committee and say, can you get me the housing figures for all counties in Scotland, if he sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. So yes, there is still, in all these aspects of question time, there is still a great deal of point. In any case, it adds to the gaiety of nations. I can remember a question addressed to a Prime Minister. And Prime Minister's questions are funny because they've got to be untransferable. If you ask about a particular issue, the Prime Minister will transfer it to the relevant departmental minister. So you must ask something that will stick to the Prime Minister. Hence, the odd question about if he will give us his engagements or something like that. And in those days, the standard question was if he will pay an official visit to Wong. And there was a question about whether the Prime Minister will pay an official visit to Damascus. And I dare say the poor man was briefed for half a morning on the British policy towards the Middle East. And he must have been staggered and horrified when this first supplementary was, and on the road to Damascus. So, yeah, it does make, it is a good House of Commons event. Even that bear garden of a Prime Minister's question time, as long as it's not overdone, as we say in the book, God, it's parliamentary theatre It's not a seminar. So it puts the excitement back into politics. It does have a function. And as I said, it's enjoyable.
Charlie?
There was, Mr. Speaker, remember Sam Gajinson's resolution in 1992 to permit not presidential questions in the plenary session, but departmental secretaries appearing periodically in the House of Representatives to answer questions. And the Gajinson resolution was referred by Speaker Foley to the Rules Committee, where it died. Although they held a hearing and filed a report, it's still out there. But the notion of separation of powers in this country and the tradition of committees being the recipients of information from the executive branch would, and in addition to the wretched taste suggestion of Speaker Clerk, would mitigate against any question period in the House of Representatives.
And can I, just at the risk of interfering in American affairs,
Oh, go ahead. Everybody else does.
such a provision was in the Constitution of the Confederate in the Civil War.
Articles of Confederation.
The Articles of Confederation. So they were going to carry it out in Montgomery or wherever the Confederate Congress sat, but the war put an end to it. It would have been an interesting experiment.
Hey, Don. Just a comment on the question period, and that is, presidents speak privately all the time to members of Congress, and sometimes they do it in a large setting. When Obama was elected and sworn in, he met with, for example, the House Republicans, as I recall, all of them in Baltimore, and then also with Senate Democrats as well. And basically, we have the question period, as Charlie indicated, during the committee hearing process and also during presidential press conferences, where you have all kinds of questions thrown up by reporters.
Okay. Before I go to Stephen here, I wanted to ask if any of our distinguished former members would like to make any comments or offer questions. We have former Speaker Foley, Vic Fazio, and now Lee Hamilton has joined us as well. Gentlemen, the microphone is coming back there. Speaker Foley.
I understand we have a new Lord Speaker in the House of Lords.
Yes, that is so.
And he has taken part of the functions of the Lord Chancellor.
No, the Lord Speaker is simply the presiding officer of the House of Lords. So yes, to that extent, she's taken what the Lord Chancellor did, and the Lord Chancellor's position is a gross abuse of the separation of powers, as someone who was in the cabinet, presided over one branch of the legislature, and headed the judiciary. That's gone. So she's taken over, the Lord Speaker's taken over one bit of the Lord Chancellor, but not the whole.
Secondly, if I may, the Liberal Democratic Party, Nick Clegg, apparently has had a long-standing interest in reform of Parliament. Can you give us some idea what their ideas are with that respect?
Yeah, I can. Since the book was written, a whole lot of things have happened thanks to the coalition. There's a bill before the House at the moment for fixed-term parliaments, 5-year fixed term. You can pull it up short if the government loses a motion of confidence or if 2/3 of the members vote to dissolve. So I'm not sure how much difference this might make in practice, but it is an attempt, largely driven by the Liberals, to restrict the prime ministerial power to pull down the shutters whenever he thinks he's going to win an election. The second thing is, again, the Liberals are in favour of this. There is to be, according to a bill before the House, a referendum on the method of voting. We're supposed to be going over to alternative voting. If the referendum okays that, and if the referendum doesn't, it will put the coalition under considerable strain. We're also going to have a much more energetic attempt to equalise the size of constituencies. Now, the drawing of boundaries is, in the UK, a non-partisan effort. But the issues which have to be taken into account when you draw a constituency boundary are so many and various that we've got one constituency in Scotland which is 1/5 of the size of a constituency in England, And the reason for these two determinations is exactly the same. They're island communities. So that the Isle of Wight off the south coast of England has a number of electors of something like 104,000, and the Western Isles has a number of constituents of 26,000. But as I say, the rationale is the same. How all that will play out, I do not know, but these are the things which the Liberal part of the coalition have been pushing.
Does the Lord Speaker have a 5-year term?
I think she does, yes. I think she does.
Okay. Mr. Fazio?
I'd like to ask a bit of question about the Senate. I know that's not your sweet spot, Charlie, but when you talk about the tortured parliamentary procedure and the CR starting in the Senate, although technically on a House measure, a lot of it relates to a 60-vote cloture requirement and holes placed on bills, sometimes public, sometimes private. Is there any analogy in the British system? And what is your opinion about the kind of strength that has been given to individuals and minorities? I remember in the House we used to say in the Senate, 99 is never enough. And that has kind of become even more embedded in the process.
Any comments, Charlie?
You were asking either or both of us that question. Okay. Well, I do spend some time critically in discussing the Senate cloture rule and the rather incredible leverage given to individual members and certainly the minority party, individual senators. And there's an interesting possible development. I don't think it's going to, we were with the Senate Parliamentarian today, the idea of how and when and if the Senate can amend its own rules by a majority vote, because one of the key rules of the Senate is that it takes 2/3, not just 3/5, to invoke cloture on a rules change, a direct rules change. So there has been some publicity given, and there's a great anecdote in 1957 when then Vice President Richard M. Nixon was presiding over the Senate, and a parliamentary inquiry came, what would it take for a new Senate on opening day to amend its rules? And without consulting anyone, Vice President Nixon went on this long monologue about, in his opinion, and by common sense, it should only take a majority. And there it is and the Senate parliamentarians have tried to hide it as precedent. Right? But there it is. I went to the record. It was incredible. It wasn't even a point of order. It was just Nixon going off for whatever reason, not citing any precedent, by the way. But now you've got Tom Udall and a number of junior Democratic senators who may have second thoughts if they lose leverage as a majority, suggesting that on opening day the Senate can, in response to a point of order, can decide that it's not only a continuing body, it's not necessarily bound with a third new membership by the 2/3 cloture rule, even though that rule says that it is, and even though the Senate doesn't re-adopt its rules, every new Senate, that if a majority of the Senate vote that is constitutionally permissible, the Senate can and should, by majority vote, somehow amend the cloture rule to make it more equitable. I'm told that effort will be attempted on opening day next January in the Senate. The success of it is pretty doubtful.
Is Mr. Biden, as a presiding officer, bound to follow his own judgment or that of the President or of the Parliamentarian of the Senate?
Yes.
Say down. Let me just add an addendum to the question, and that is one of the issues is, and by the way, that Vice President Nixon, when he presided, one of those cases actually went against the ruling of the Senate Parliamentarian. He said that I will make this decision even though the Senate Parliamentarian disagrees with it, and that's where he said that, in his judgment, a majority of the Senate under Article 1 of the Constitution can, at the opening of a new Congress, establish new rules by majority vote. Now the hooker is this, that anybody could raise a point of order. And under the precedents of the Senate, which go back to 1803, the presiding officer, the President of the Senate, is obligated to submit that constitutional question to the full chamber for consideration. And the issue is that is filibusterable. So then you've got to get the 2/3 vote to shut down the talkathon in order to get a chance to amend the rules. I mean, it's a catch-22 circumstance.
Thank you. That's
We don't at Westminster have anything quite so elaborate. The only, well, it's the virtue of not having a constitution. The only comment I could make is you can bring a debate, any debate, to an end if two things happen. The first one is if you move that the question be now put while debate is still running, and the chair accepts that, then you will get your vote. But in that vote, you not only have to win the numbers, you've got to have 100 voting in, at least 100 voting in the majority. So you sometimes have the distressing signs of government whips coming to the chair and asking privately whether the chair would be disposed to accept a motion for the closure. And it's not long before the opposition members discover exactly what's being discussed and begin to jeer. The other consideration is the Speaker will, in matters of order, rule, and his ruling is final. A ruling of the Speaker cannot be appealed. You can, and I've never known it, try to change the rule and perhaps deplore what the Speaker has done. I think that's extremely unlikely. The Speaker's word on order is queried only by the very unwise.
Let me call on our President and Director, Lee Hamilton, now.
Thank you, Don. No question, but I just want to say a word of appreciation to the two authors of this book, Parliament and the Congress. I really think it's a very significant piece of work that they have done. That is not only valuable today, but will be valuable for many, many years to come. I think that, democracy is a process and not a result. And in a country as big and complicated as ours, the procedures of parliamentary bodies, including the Congress, become extraordinarily complex. And in order to have any kind of order at all in the Congress, and I suspect for state legislatures as well, you've really got to have good parliamentarians. And so I just want to say that these two gentlemen have contributed enormously to parliamentary democracy, to representative democracy, because of their skills as parliamentarians. And I want all of you to know how critically important their role is in the operation of the Congress, and I'm sure the Parliament as well. Tom Foley and Vic Fazio could say more about this than I, but both of them in positions of major leadership in the House. And my guess, Tom and Vic, would be that you folks could hardly turn around without consulting the parliamentarian pretty regularly. So our thanks to you, gentlemen, and our appreciation for your outstanding service.
Thank you, Lee. All right, I think let's bring the microphone up to Stephen Shore.
My question is, could you contrast in some detail the difference and similarities between the Queen's speech and the State of the Union address?
Good question. Difference between the Queen's speech and the State of the Union address.
Well, I don't know. Perhaps I think perhaps the contrast ought to come out of what you hear. Neither of us may be able to look across the piece and give you, I can't give you my view, or no point in my giving you my view of the State of the Union address. The Queen's speech is simply a checklist of what the government principally thinks it's going to do. And it used to be regarded as a very, very secret, terrible thing to do, high treason, to reveal what was in it before she made it. Discourteous to the Queen, nothing was. And since then, over the past 5 years, the government began to consult, to ask the political nation what they thought by producing a draft Queen's speech. That has rather, I think, has rather dropped away because the political nation wasn't really interested. So still, we're back to this is the list. It's not a definitive list. These are the places the government is going to go. It has a certain constitutional importance in that one of the rules, we were talking about this earlier, one of the financial rules is that the House of Commons will not grant any money except upon the demand of the Crown. And the demand of the Crown is expressed in the Queen's speech. Members of the House of Commons estimates for the public service will be laid before you. So there is the speech itself. There is something like 4, maybe sometimes 5 days debate, ranging widely, and then on the last 2 days, focusing on individual topics. It's a scene-setting exercise for the following session.
But the speech is written by the Prime Minister.
Oh.
Yeah.
In the government and in the Parliament. And that very constitutionally spells out the major difference under separation of powers. The executive branch may consult with leaders of Congress in preparing the President's State of the Union address, but certainly when there are opposition members, majorities in the House or Senate from the White House, that consultation is probably very minimal. But it's that separate presentation by the executive branch of those ideas to a joint session which trigger not only the beginning of the year, but by tradition trigger the submission of the budget, the President's budget, upon which Congress begins to hold hearings, and then, presumably under the law, develops its own budget as an alternative. But the President's submitted budget, and there are folks here who know a lot more about it than I do, contains very detailed information, not just numbers, but policy provisions on what perhaps flesh out the President's political agenda as stated in the State of the Union. So it's that combination of the State of the Union speech and the submission of the budget shortly thereafter that start the legislative session.
One thing that Charlie alluded to, I think, in his opening remarks is that Thomas Jefferson did not deliver a message to Congress in person because he felt it resembled too much the address of the Crown to the Parliament, and he thought it would be too monarchical for him to do that. So John Adams was the last one, and then Woodrow Wilson then resumed again the process in 1913, and to this day Woodrow Wilson holds a record for the most addresses before joint sessions of Congress. He loved to talk to the Congress, and this was before radio or television even, but he felt it was a way to talk to the nation as well, I think. We have time for maybe one more question. Let's go with Monty Tripp.
You've indicated that in Great Britain no money is granted except at the request of the government. So how do members of Parliament establish their own funding priorities, the British equivalent of congressionally directed funding or earmarks?
There is none.
Well, that's a good, quick answer. With that, we're going to bring this part of the program to a close, but we can continue discussion over some wine and cheese in the back, and there will be some books available, or a few books there at a discount rate, so we invite you to purchase a book as well. But please join me in thanking our panel.